Southern California, sunny Southern California, where it never rains, which could be a problem. We have these droughts. I can remember growing up, and there would be, probably we hadn't seen rain in like 4 or 5 years, and it was just such this dry, we rationing water, and the vegetation is kind of brown. There's some greenery, and so a lot of that. And when you look at and when you talk to persons that are familiar with geography, they talk about Southern California, and the climate in Southern California is exactly similar. There's two types of climate. There's two regions where this climate exists. It's in Southern California, and it's in the ancient Near Eastern or the Mediterranean world, where we will actually find the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I have a couple of PowerPoints, some slides up here, so you can kind of see the background of the geography where you find this manuscript, this rolled out, and there's a jar behind it, and you see a cave to the right of this, and that's actually a cliff where there's a cave opening. That's actually one of the caves where they actually found the Dead Sea Scrolls, and of course in the background you would see kind of some of the terrain. But to start off, you mind if we pray? Lord, we thank you, we honor you, we bless you, we glorify you for this wonderful day, for this day that we've never seen before, this day that we will never see again. So we bless you for allowing us to be gathered in this space, to be speaking and talking and learning about the Word, and the Word that comes through from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So Lord, I pray that you will meet us in this space. I pray that you will challenge us, encourage us, inspire us, and show up in a marvelous, mighty way. In Jesus' name, we pray for each and every single individual that's here. Lord, hear this prayer. In Jesus' name, amen. So what are the Dead Sea Scrolls? Does anybody know, anybody familiar? What are the Dead Sea Scrolls? Not the scholars in the room here. But what are the Dead Sea Scrolls? Are you familiar? Anybody familiar? Go ahead and shout out. I come from a tradition. You can go ahead and shout at me, and I respond. But is anybody familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls? What are the Dead Sea Scrolls? Anybody familiar? Okay. Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the reason why they got their name is that they actually found these manuscripts and fragments, almost over 1,000 fragments and manuscripts, in the Judean desert between 1947 and 1956. And the story goes is that there were these Bedouin shepherds, these teenage boys in the 1940s, these Muslim Bedouin shepherds, and they were tending their sheep, and they were walking down the wadi, which is essentially, it's a valley in the Judean desert. And these Bedouin in this particular area, and they still live out there in the desert. They make their home in the desert. And so they were tending their sheep, they were walking up the wadi, and you have all these openings of caves, as you saw. And one story goes is that one of the young men threw a rock in one of those caves and heard shattering of pottery. It was well into the evening, so they vowed to return home, vowed to return after the evening. And so some days later, one of the young men came back and climbed up in the cave and actually found pottery shards, like these broken pottery elements. And they found these, if you can go back to the very first slide, they found these long jars that you see in the back. And they found those jars sealed. And they opened those jars and they actually pulled out a manuscript like this. The thing about manuscripts is that in the ancient period, in ancient times, particularly in the first century, you had these manuscripts that you roll and you unroll, and they have the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, what we know. And they found these, and they were written in Hebrew. Not the kind of Hebrew that we would actually study today, but the Hebrew that's written in my hand, and it's not vowel pointed. So, and to them, they're teenage Bedouin shepherd boys. They didn't understand what these are. So they found their way to a local antiquities dealer who actually got in contact with one of the Syrian monks of Palestine in that area. And so there's a long history, but essentially these writings were validated as being over 2,000 years old. And they found three types of literature among the Dead Sea Scrolls. They found Bible material, or what we would know as Bible material, pseudepigrapha writings. Pseudepigrapha writings are simply writings that are what we would now call falsely ascribed to ancient biblical characters or ancient biblical periods, like the Book of Enoch, or Enochic literature, or the Book of Jubilees. And they found the third type is sectarian literature, sectarian writings, which would be like legal documents, calendrical writings about the calendar. And so, in this time, calendrical writings are about which days of the week do we follow? Do we follow a lunar solar calendar where 354 days of the week, or a solar lunar calendar we follow 364 days of the week? And so there is some discrepancy. And so you found some calendrical writings. You found these sectarian writings. You find one of the main writings is called The Rule of the Community. And it talks about how the community is to live. And we found those manuscripts, those writings in the caves, and it's overlooking a site called Khirbet Qumran. That's the actual site where a settlement, where people actually lived, this early Jewish priestly community. They understand themselves as a priestly community. And now, so myself being the only person of African descent, looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls, looking at the archaeology, I'm asking questions of ethnicity. Archaeology and anthropology, anthropology gets, when we're looking at the archaeological remains and what's at the actual site. I know I'm jumping way ahead. I don't know if you can go to the actual Qumran site. They're actually with the pictures. Yeah, so that's actually the entryway, if you will, as you're walking. If anybody's ever been to Israel, you see all these palm trees and you see a lot of olive trees, where you see all these types of miniature type palm trees. The next slide. So this is actually the terrain or the area. So you see Jerusalem, which is like northwest of Qumran, and Qumran just hugs the edge of the Dead Sea. South of that, you see a place called En-Gedi. And south of that, you see a place called Masada. So from the south, from Masada, to the north to En-Gedi, to the further north, the tip, Qumran, that's where you have Qumran. That's where the actual site was. And the caves were overlooking Qumran, the Khirbet Qumran, which is the site at Qumran. And the reason why we call these the Dead Sea Scrolls is because it all is overlooking the Dead Sea. Okay? So, and that's what you see, the blue, the Dead Sea. The next slide. So here's an aerial view of the actual site. And you would see some of the caves that kind of dot towards the bottom of these slides. You see the Qumran site. I don't have my pointer, but you see Qumran in the center. You see cave number 4. Now, there were 11 caves that were found between 1947 and 1956. And you see the site, and you see what I have pointed out is a latrine site, right? This is a priestly community. They're interested in purification. So it would make sense that their latrine, their toilets, are outside the community. Well, also outside the community is their cemetery. And at their cemetery, they found the anthropological remains revealed that about 6 or 7 skeletal remains that they actually dug up, that they were mostly male. I think they found 1 female. So we understand that, and we associate the principal community associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls as the Essenes, right? We understand that there's the Essenes. So during the 1st century, Common Era, AD, we have the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots, and the Essenes. The Bible doesn't really talk about the Essenes, but they were very familiar and they were contemporaneous with one another. They all lived at the same time. Well, the Essenes, there was a community that actually lived in Jerusalem, but there's actually a community that left Jerusalem because they believed themselves to be a priestly community, because in their writings, I talked about those three types of writing: Bible material, pseudepigrapha writings, and sectarian writings. Well, in the sectarian writings, these Essenes, they describe themselves as the Bnei Zadakim, or the sons of Zadok. Zadok was the priest during the time David and Solomon were kings. They were the priests that were installed as the priests, if you will, at that particular time. So this community, the Dead Sea Scrolls community, I also call them the Qumran community, because they actually leave Jerusalem and go to this Qumran site from Jerusalem to Qumran, because they believe that the temple and Jerusalem was defiled at that particular time. And so as the archaeology reveals, the next slide. As the archaeology reveals, like, this is the site. You find all this rubble, but you find different kinds of, you find divisions of how the site is laid out. And you find outside the site, of course, there's a latrine, but there's also a cemetery, and there's these skeletal remains that are found. And the way in which these skeletal remains were found was very interesting. And anthropologists aren't really talking about this. But the way that they were buried covered with rock, not buried with dirt. They were buried and covered with rock. In Jewish and Israel burial customs, they buried them in tombs in these kind of catacombs. Right? You would it'd be kind of a cliff, if you will, and there'd be an opening, and there'd be a stone that blocks this, and you walk into the opening, and you could look and you see these little enclaves, if you will, these little, they call them catacombs, and they would actually have a tomb. Well, they would actually have these boxes, hewn in rocks, and they would actually put the bodies in these catacombs. Right? And so you can go in there and you'd see families that are buried in there. Well, at Qumran, they didn't have that. They had the skeletal remains were buried, covered with rock. And every single skeletal remain they found the skull was facing towards the south. Why is that interesting? Why is that distinct? Because this is the exact burial custom that they bury the Egyptians. Egyptians are buried, covered with rocks, and every skeletal remain, the head, the skull is facing towards the south. Because the south is considered Nubia, is considered the cradle of civilization. And so it raises the question, to me, what is the ethnicity of the people of Qumran? What is the ethnicity of these individuals? Because their burial customs are exactly identical. Nobody's talking about that among Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship or Qumran scholarship. So, but this is the site, and there's a lot of other interesting things, and as we go through, we will find some more kinds of things. Anybody have any questions or comments up to this point? Okay, a captive audience, all right.
No, I appreciate the just information you brought about various traditions there and connecting that to
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's interesting.
I hadn't heard of that at all when discussing anything about this.
Yes, yeah. Yes. Brodus note? Okay. Okay, okay. Right. Yes. Yeah, and the darker one's skin is, even today if you were to go to Egypt, if you were dark skinned, there's a kind of there's a kind of, I would say, a profiling of you, but it's a profiling in the sense that you reflect a kind of Nubian presence, and there's that consciousness, there's that understanding within that culture, within with the context. They understand that the darker a person is, that reflects a kind of Nubian, this kind of southern, towards Tanzania, towards, and that cradle of civilization. So it's kind of an understood thing even within Egypt, because, Egypt, you have division of northern Egypt and southern Egypt. Southern Egypt in the kind of, in the north. You have it, because the Nile is the only river that flows from south to north, which is interesting. Most rivers flow from north to south. So you have a lot of these interesting kinds of dynamics within this region. And if we went back to the map of Qumran, it's essentially, because there was no Suez Canal dug at this particular time during the first century, late Second Temple period. First century, the time in which Jesus lived, was considered the late Second Temple period. Late Second Temple period because the first temple, we see, Solomon, David and Solomon, first temple is constructed. That temple is destroyed when Nebuchadnezzar comes in and destroys and takes those of choice, the choice Israelites, they take them to Babylon. That temple is destroyed. And then during Nehemiah's temple plan, the second temple is erected. And here you have the second temple from the time of Nehemiah, and the returnees come back to about 68 AD, when the temple is destroyed by the Romans, essentially. So now you have the second temple period. And the late second temple period is a period in the time in which the New Testament is written and recorded, and Jesus and the disciples are actually engaged in ministry, the late Second Temple period. So the late Second Temple period, which is also the first century AD, is around the time that you have the Qumran community that also exists. And some scholars have suggested that John the Baptist may have been in a scene, or Jesus may have been in a scene. The reason why they say about John is because John, when he was old, when he was born, that his parents are described as being very old. And it's interesting, Luke 1:7, they use that adjective, very old. So here you have this child of this promise who's now born to these very old individuals' parents. And Josephus, who's a Jewish historian who also writes around the same time period, talks about the Essenes have a habit and a tradition of adopting other men's children, especially when they are young, influential, and they can be molded. And John's parents were priests. They were from a priestly tradition, a priestly line. And so the scholarship suggests is that John may have been adopted because his parents were old. He was also from a priestly line. And when he's baptizing in the wilderness, it's the same area around Qumran. Can we go to the next slide? I don't know if yeah, it's the same area, this same Judean wilderness area, this deserty area. You find some places like in California, just very desert, very dry. That's where John the Baptist is essentially baptizing people in the Jordan. So they suggest that there's some connections, and there's lots of differences as well. So, but the description of the community describing themselves in their own sectarian literature, right? There's Bible material, there's pseudepigraphy material, there's sectarian material. They call themselves the sons of Zadok. And it's interesting because when you look and you think about the sons of Zadok in Egypt, so the history is that as the returnees, or as Israel, as the children of Israel are in Babylon, Babylon falls to Macedonia, the Macedonians, Philip of Macedon, who's the father of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, after he dies in 323, it's two of his generals remain and they're fighting. One is Ptolemy of Egypt. The second one is Seleucus of Syria. Well, they wrestle control, and the area of Palestine, of which this area is, they take turns being under their empire, if you will. Under Ptolemy of Egypt, it's very calm. The Jews can worship in the temple. They can continue their worship, religious practices. But under the Syrians, under Seleucus and his sons Antiochus III and Antiochus IV, it's more hostile. And so by the time the Syrians wrestle control of Palestine away from Ptolemy and the Egyptians, it's more hostile. And around the time that Antiochus, the Syrian ruler, Antiochus IV, who calls himself Epiphanes, right? He's a very modest guy. Epiphanes, he understood himself as an incarnate of God. He self-declared himself Epiphanes. Right? Thank God we don't have leaders like that today, self-declaring themselves. So Antiochus, so as he controls the temple, he demands that there's sacrifice on his birthday in the temple. And they sacrifice swine. They have to have bacon, they have to have ham. So they sacrifice swine in Jerusalem in the Jewish temple. Well, that's a no-no, because that defiles the temple, which causes, of course, the community, of course, to fight first and then eventually to leave and go to Qumran. But before there's fighting, Antiochus kills the priest, who was Onias IV. Onias IV was a priest of a Zadok line. He was a Zadok priest in Jerusalem's temple. Well, of course, Onias has a son. Onias III is murdered. Onias' son, Onias IV, they flee to Egypt. This story sounds familiar, fleeing to Egypt, because you always have the story of those in Jerusalem fleeing to Egypt. It's very close. It's almost in that time you could walk for the most part. He flees to Egypt, this Zadok priest, Onias IV, after his father's murdered. And this is also what we call during the Jewish temple, the Jewish time, that there is no one occupying as the high priest in Jerusalem's temple, in the Jewish temple, and they call that the intersacerdotum. Very first time ever in the history of Israel when the temple is standing, no priest occupying. So, but what happens is Onias' son, he flees to Egypt and sets up a Jewish temple in Leontopolis, Egypt, northern Egypt. For the very first time, you have a Jewish temple set up by Jewish people and Jewish priests outside of Jerusalem. And where is it? It's in Egypt. And archaeology bears this and tests this out. And you have the archaeological find. Nobody can hide that, because archaeologists says this is a temple, and it's a Jewish temple, and on some of the archaeological finds we find Zadok, Onias the Zadok priest. That's stunning. Here you have Egypt again. It just kind of keeps coming up. This is Africa. These are people of color. And if you're going to have a temple in an area and a region, then a temple has to be supported by the people. And if the people are dark-skinned people, who do you think is going to that temple? And so it's no accident that we see people of color within the biblical text. But so that's interesting. So that raises even a further question of the ethnicity of the people of Qumran and the burial customs. Because if the Zadok line was in Egypt before they actually went to Qumran, because within the sectarian writings of the Dead Sea Scrolls, right, talk about the Bible literature, the pseudepigraphic literature, and the sectarian literature. Within the sectarian literature, there's this cryptic term that talks about that the community, they call themselves the Yahad, the community, they flee to the land of Damascus until the time of returning. And so Damascus is Syria, but there has been no archaeological finds that proves and tests or that can identify a Jewish priestly community anywhere in Syria. The only place they can find is Qumran, but that's attested for, but that's not Damascus. So this notion of in the land of Damascus seems to be a cryptic term. My theory is that they went to northern Egypt and set up the temple there because you have a Zadok priestly community in Egypt about 50 to 60 years before actually going to Qumran. And they call themselves the priests, the sons of Zadok, the Bnei Zadokim. So there's a lot of significance that the Dead Sea Scrolls has for understanding Bible, for understanding Judaism, early Judaism, because before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, Judaism was understood as what Rabbinic Judaism talks about. Well, that's only just half or maybe even a third of the story, because you have the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots, and from the Dead Sea Scrolls we now have the Essenes, which coincide with what Philo, the Jewish historian Philo and Pliny, Jewish archaeologist or Jewish anthropologist, and Philo, right? They're all writing contemporaneous with us. These are classical Greek writers that are writing about Jewish history and Jewish period, Jewish time. They talk about the Essenes, and all of that correlates with the Dead Sea Scrolls sectarian writings, and that correlates with the actual site and the finds that you actually find with the archaeology and the anthropological. So we've connected the dots there. Let's see what's on the next slide. Any questions so far? Comments? Observations? Here's the caves where these writings were found. The idea is that as the Romans are coming up to sack Jerusalem around 68 Common Era or AD, is that you have this settlement at Qumran that begins to deposit their writings in these caves. And this would be one of the caves. Next one. This would be what a cave looks like inside. So when that Bedouin shepherd throws a rock inside, imagine there's pottery all in here, and one of the pottery shatters. And then you find manuscripts, and you find also fragments, these kind of puzzle piece fragments. They'd be all in that cave. Now, from my studies and my research, I've only found one Qumran scholar admit this. What's the next slide? The next slide. So there's the jar where the caves are found, where the manuscripts are found. The manuscripts, you asked the question, so the manuscripts were written, they were animal skin. So certain kind of animals that they actually would treat within a tannery and prepare for writing on. And when they found these scrolls, when they found these manuscripts, of course the leather shrinks, because anytime you have skin or you have leather, over time it shrinks. So the writings is very small. But what you find, and only one scholar has admitted this, because you have ancient writings written on animal skins that's preserved over 2,000 years. How is that possible in such arid condition? Only one Qumran scholar has admitted this, that the way in which the scrolls were preserved and wrapped and covered was exactly identical to the way mummies are wrapped. Only one Qumran scholar has admitted that. It's stunning. And so the recent 2001 excavation and discovery around Qumran, they found skeletal remains of a young boy. And there's an article that, where was that article you just sent me? CNN just published that they found part of the flesh and some of the hair on that boy still preserved, because of the way that that body was wrapped, as a way, and they admitted it as kind of mummified. They wrapped him in the way that mummies would be wrapped in Egypt. This is at Qumran. Yeah, these are Bible, Zechariah, some Bible fragments. And as we go through, we'll see what those fragments are. The fragments are tougher to read or harder to read, especially if they're smaller and depending on how they're preserved, because over time, when the air hits them, the oxidation, and they turn black. So initially, because they're animal skins, the way that you test and prove that they're archaic in nature, you do DNA testing. That's what they did initially. Well, the problem with DNA testing is what? You have to actually rip a piece off and undertake, so you're actually destroying the artifact. So then they do carbon testing. So like, if there's anything that's ever been alive, if it's been buried, preserved, you can tell how old it is by the amount of carbon it emits, right? And so they can tell the carbon based on the level of carbon that has been emitted from these skins, these leathers, and same thing with bones, right? But recently, I think it was in 1996, there was a scientist who developed a digital imaging machine. And this was for something else, because he was working for JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, NASA. But they found that when they put these ancient manuscripts under this digital imaging machine, it enhances the images. And actually, they were able to enhance images of an unreadable fragment to see the letters and see the writings. And so that has been kind of a revolution in reading the Dead Sea Scrolls as well. Yeah. Yes? Yes. Yeah. So there's a couple of things that causes this community to leave. So first of all, they understand themselves as a priestly community. During this time, during the late Second Temple period, after Israel returns, after those who were in captivity, after they return, well, there were individuals that never left. And so those who return, they understand themselves as being the rightful heirs of Jerusalem and all that goes in religious and temple. Well, there were those that never left. So now you begin to get the distinct sectarian groups: Pharisees, Sadducees, the Essenes, the Zealots. You have all the Samaritans. You have all of these individuals now clashing and coming together. And so the Essenes, understanding themselves as the descendants of Zadok, who were the priests during the time of the beloved King David and Solomon, were kings of Israel. Well, they understand themselves as the rightful heirs to the priesthood. But who's now in the priesthood? Because you have the Maccabees that rise up against the Syrians and they fight them. You have the Hasmoneans, the Maccabee Judas the Hammer, Maccabeus Simon. And so Simon, after they struck a deal with the Assyrians, but they also declare themselves as priests. Well, where in the Bible were they consecrated, or did God call them to be priests? They declared themselves priests, the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans. And so there's this tension between the Maccabees, those who declare themselves a priest and occupying the priesthood, and those who rightfully have come back, and those who consider themselves along the lines of Zadok, who are rightfully by God supposed to be the priests. And then there's also this desecration in the temple because of what the Syrians, what Antiochus is doing. But the Essenes understand themselves as part of a Sadducean line. The Sadducean comes from a term and a notion called, I have a brain fog, the chasadim, or what we have Hasidic, preserving pure tradition. And so, you have the Hasidic or the Chasadim, where out of them come the Sadducees, and out of them come pretty much everyone except the Pharisees, and the Essenes as well. But the thing that makes the Essenes distinct from the Sadducees is that the Sadducees follow a lunar solar calendar. So the day for them begins at sundown because they're following the lunar solar. So the moon declares, when you see the moon, we have a new day. As opposed to the Pharisees and the Essenes who adopt a solar lunar calendar, where when you see the sun, that's a new day. Sun up, sunrise. So there's this tension between when does the day start? Sundown or sun up? And so here you have this tension, and we even see this in the Bible, right? Why is Jesus always at odds with the Jews and the Pharisees and the Sadducees? Because of the calendar. And if you have an issue of the calendar, and let's say someone is impure, someone is unclean, and you have to wait until you have to offer your sacrifice, wash yourself clean, and the priest declares you clean, and you have to wait until the new day before you can become declared clean. Well, depending on the priest that you go to, the priest is following the lunar solar calendar, says, well, once sundown is, you are clean. Now you can go out. Well, but if you're one of the ones that follow the solar lunar calendar, you're walking around unclean, contaminated. So there's this issue with the calendar. And so that would be that's one of the reasons. Plus they also have a different modus operandi of how sacrifices to be offered, when sacrifices to be offered. So that's a long answer. But those are some of the reasons why these Essenes, because those in Jerusalem were following a lunar solar calendar, plus the temple in Jerusalem was viewed as being defiled because of the foreign influence. So you had all these different tensions, these infighting. And so there's one document within the Dead Sea Scrolls, Mitzah Ma'atzeh HaTorah. It comes from Cave 4, and we call it 4QMMT. And it talks about a we group telling a you group not to be like a they group. And what we believe this document is suggesting is that we have a tension between the Essenes, a Pharisaic group, and the Sadducean group. So within the Dead Sea Scrolls, we see at least 3 different Jewish factions attested for. And what the Dead Sea Scrolls really now shows us is that Judaism during the time of Jesus was not monolithic. They didn't all believe the same thing. They didn't all worship in the same way. They didn't all believe in the same calendar. They didn't all believe the way the sacrifices were supposed to be done. They didn't all agree in the same way. So I asked this question: what is the oldest existing Bible on the planet of the earth? It's like a movie, The Planet of the Apes, Planet of the Earth. Job? The oldest Bible. The oldest Bible. And this may get into manuscripts because the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text is a collection of Hebrew manuscripts that were used that were used in the translation of all modern Bibles: German, French, Latin, English Bible. Every Bible that you have, every Bible that you own, is based off of the Masoretic text. That text was found at Qumran among the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are also 3 other versions of the Bible found at Qumran. And the Masoretic text that we use dates to about 1000, it was 980, right, from the Biblia Hebrea Stuttgart, right? There was one that dated around 800 or 700, but a fire had actually destroyed that manuscript. And so the one that's preserved is about 1000 AD dated. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserves the four versions, but the Bible manuscripts among the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of the oldest ones date to about the 3rd century before Christ. And the Masoretic text is also among them. The Septuagint is found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, we understand the Septuagint. Those of you who know Septuagint is the Greek version of the Old Testament. And Jewish scholars have been dismissive of the Septuagint because they say there's differences there. And the differences could be attested to Hellenistic influences. Well, they found the version or the source for the Septuagint in Hebrew among the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that attests that the Septuagint is a bona fide, legitimate, authentic Jewish version of the Old Testament. They also found the Samaritan Pentateuch among the Dead Sea Scroll fragments and manuscripts. And then they found a version of the Old Testament that has not been attested for until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, when I say versions of the Bible, I'm talking fragments. I'm talking here's a book here, or passages here, chapters here, chapters there. But as far as full, intact writings, entire books, Isaiah probably would be the only and the closest one. And we'll see that as we look at some other slides. But yeah, any questions? We go to the next slide. I know I've said a lot. Yes, yes.
And so it's kind of hard. As a matter of fact, I like what one guy said. I don't know if you're familiar with Khirbet, but he does, when we hear this idea that Christianity is a white man's religion, he argues that it is a perpetuation of systemic racism when we make that, and African Americans make that case all the time. They make that case all the time. So when we look and we see then that the Dead Sea Scrolls answer or show or prove that what we have is an accurate translation, it kind of takes that argument off the table, especially when you bring in the ethnicity piece that we're dealing with today.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. I mean, it takes off the table. Anyone that says Christianity is a white man's religion doesn't know history. Christianity was birthed out of an African seedbed. And even Tom Oden has admitted that in looking at African scholars who have been saying that for years before he said it. But just because a white person says it shouldn't make it legitimate, but that's kind of the world we live in. The biblical text and the Dead Sea Scrolls relating to the biblical text connects us to Africa and African peoples of color, both in literature, archaeologically, and geographically. There's just too much information. I would even make the case, and this is the very first time I'm actually saying this, the Dead Sea Scrolls perhaps are even birthed out of an African seedbed. I like that. I'm gonna use that. Because when you look at the priestly line, the Zadoks, before they come to Qumran and any sectarian writing is actually written, they had been in Egypt. They had been, this is my theory, they had been in Leontopolis, Egypt, at that temple that was under the priesthood of Onias, who was of Zadok's line. Yeah.
No, no, I appreciate that. And I just, but yeah, no, that really, I think, helps.
If somebody wants to find one of the, I'm sorry, we can go back. Somebody wants to find one of these passages, First Kings 18:33, or Luke 22:10, or John 2:1 through 10, or 4:28, and we'll just read that, and this will kind of give us some reference to that. But yeah, I didn't mean to disrupt your thought there. Yeah, so there's so much, and there's archaeological material, archaeological finds, and we'll look at one of those. Yes.
Then he arranged the wood and cut the oxen pieces and laid it on the wood.
Keep going.
And he said, fill 4 pitchers with water and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood. And he said, do it a second time. And they did the second time. And he said, do it a third time. And they did the third time. The water flowed around the altar, and he overfilled the trench with water.
So this is about when Elijah was telling the person who was worshiping the Baal god, right? If your God is real, then ask him to dry up this wood. Well, the water jars, the one on the left would be something similar that you would see. So in John chapter 2, the wedding at Cana, when the wine dried up, Jesus said, fill, what is it? Was it 6 pitcher jars? Six jars? This would have been what you would see, that jar. They fill that with water. And they actually found jars like this at Qumran. The one on the right is a kind of jar that you would have found the scrolls within. The next slide.
So, I mean, in real time, I mean, how big are we talking?
So yeah, we're maybe like the size of one's waist. Like if you ever get a chance to see a Dead Sea Scrolls exhibit, they used to travel around the country before the pandemic. But yeah, they're probably around like my hip waist size. You have the 2 handles. So yeah, I mean, and imagine, well, anything you fill up with water, any kind of jar you fill up with water, it takes, so those jars, it's going to take a couple of individuals to fill, So yeah, these are pretty big. And these are stone, which has a sense of weight as well. Empty. Yeah. Clay. These are Qumran plates. They found a lot of these around the site. And they thought, of course, maybe they're from ritual meals and whatnot. The next slide. Anybody can find one of these passages. These are coins. There's Matthew, Luke, or John. Any one of those passages you can find and read that. But these would be fine. They found numerous coins among the site. And what we call this is numismatic evidence. It's essentially numismatic material. So coins are important in archaeology because they help you to determine when a site was actually occupied. Pottery does as well, because we look at the style of the pottery. Like, is this pottery during the time of Herod, the time of the Maccabees? And so that helps us. But when we find coins usually have the image of the Caesar, the image of who is the emperor. Anybody have any of those passages? One passage I can think of is, when Jesus was asked, should we pay taxes? And he says, whose image do you see on the coin? And render unto Caesar what's Caesar, and unto God. Well, this would have been a kind of coin that would have been taken to Jesus. And I believe it's similar coins because the Qumran community is contemporaneous with the time of Jesus. Right? Jesus knew about this community. John knew about this community. Everybody knew about this community because they all existed at the same time. The next slide. Any one of those references somebody can find. This is an oil lamp. So this would be something that would have been found at Qumran as well, and there are some biblical passages. We can go to the next slide. Here's an inkwell, and they found a couple of inkwells at Qumran. So the reason why I'm going through these archaeological finds is because this kind of helps to determine what kind of activity was taking place at this site, or who these people were. We can't necessarily identify and say this community was here. Archaeology doesn't do that. Archaeologist says that this is the time period when the site was occupied, and this is the activity that took place. And so here's an inkwell, and the thing about this is they actually found dried ink inside. And they found a few of these. What this suggests is that this was this was a community that was engaged in scribal activity, that they actually wrote. Right? So, and there's some Bible passages right there. The next slide. Any question? Here's a sandal that was actually found at Qumran. A Bible passage that I like to use is when Moses is in the wilderness and he sees a burning bush. And as he approaches, he hears a voice, "Moses, remove your sandals, for the ground on which you stand is holy ground." And the next passage I think of is when John the Baptist refers to Jesus, "I am not worthy to unlatch," or to unlatch the laces of his sandal. So that's an actual sandal, a leather sandal. And it was actually probably about a size 7, a women's size, if you will. Small feet. Well, I'm not sure. I don't want to talk about anybody's feet. But that's the actual sandal. We could move quickly to the next slide. Yeah. These combs, these were actual combs that were found among the Qumran site. I want to linger here, and I want you to just look at those combs. And be open to share your thoughts. Think about all those times Jesus, the disciples, all those biblical figures and characters, what did they use to comb their hair? What did they use to groom their hair? It kind of puts this into kind of human terms, if you will, or identifiable terms, right? Yeah. What kind of hair do you think these combs are suited for, if you will? Coarse, okay. Even the fine-sided. Teeth missing. Two-sided comb, yeah. You know, I had a comb, like the one on the left. I was a barber for about 7 years, because I was supposed to be a movie star. When I was coming, I'm growing up in Southern California, I was supposed to be a movie star. I was trying to convince my parents I was supposed to be a movie star, but they didn't buy that, so they sent me to barber college without my permission. But they said, because I'm living in their house, I guess, I have to follow the rules, especially if I want to live in their house. So they sent me to barber college, and so I would see these different kinds of combs. But I do remember the comb on the left. Probably if you cut that in half, and you take the fine tooth side away, and as you further extend out, it gets thinner and thinner and thinner, and at the very tip of the comb, you have an Afro fist. I used to have one of those in my back pocket. The comb looked just like that. And it was sharp at the teeth. And if you dig in a little too hard, you can, But sometimes my afro would be a little coarse that one of the teeth would break off. So that's what that reminds me of. But it also reminds me of like a shampoo comb. When we were in barber college, we would actually, those who had coarse or hair, straight hair, curly hair, as we washed and shampoo, we would comb it out. It'd be a little more manageable to comb out. The fine tooth, maybe we use to comb our eyebrows or mustache, or, if you have even finer hair. But yeah, these are actual combs that were found, which further gives me questions with regard to the ethnicity of the people. When I was doing my doctoral studies in Manchester, I went to Manchester, England, to do my doctoral studies in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and every week we would have a scholar that would come and do a lecture during the Earhart lectures. And one particular scholar, can I say his name? Mogen Broshi. I shouldn't say his name. He was an archaeologist, Israeli archaeologist, a white fella. And I asked him a question, because this is when I discovered and was looking into the burial customs. And I said, Dr. Broshi, I said, what connection do you think, based on the burial customs at Qumran being similar to the ones in Egypt, what connection? Before I can get my question out, he says, no connection, no connection, no connection. I said, well, let me ask you. He said, no connection, no connection. So when I was studying for my doctorate, and as I was training to be a scholar, I was trained and taught that every question is worth exploring, and every question can be on the table, especially if there's evidence. No question should be dismissed. It should be explored. But yet here, before I can even get my question out, I'm being dismissed by this Israeli archaeologist, which further heightened my hermeneutic of suspicion, to borrow that term. Yes? Yeah, that's when they developed the Israeli Antiquities Authority, the IAA. So the idea was that if one found the manuscript, so the Israeli Antiquities Authority. So when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in 1947, the area that the caves were and the site was, that was part of Jordan. That was Jordanian territory, Jordanian. And it was towards the tail end of 1947 and 1948 where you had because all of this area was British occupied, and the United Nations developed the state of Israel during 1948. And the area where the Dead Sea Scrolls are found in Jordan, that was now divided up and given to this new state of Israel, Palestine. That caused a 6-day war, and then there was another war in 1967. And as these wars happened, the state of Israel would kind of grow even further and further out, taking more and more of the area. Because if you think of the idea that Israel fell, Jerusalem fell in 67, 68, 70, the destruction of the Second Temple, and then you have the scattering. But you have individuals that never left, and a lot of those individuals that never left were people of African descent. And so you have this hotly contested area. I mean, it's an incredibly hotly contested area. And so the idea of whose writings or who, when you find archaeological materials, who do they belong to? When these artifacts began to be unearthed, There was a black market, of course. You know, a fragment could be sold for maybe $50,000, $60,000. They were finding fragments in people's shoe boxes underneath their beds, you know, in the area because they were going for $30,000, $20,000. And so the black market is very lucrative if you find anything, any kind of artifact. It's very lucrative. If you're looking for a business to get into, that's a joke. In 1976, and I think it was 1975, the publication, The 13th Tribe, was published by a Jewish, white Jewish Israeli journalist. 1975. 1976, this Jewish journalist, he was living in London. He mysteriously wound up murdered in London. If we go back to his book, The 13th Tribe, the 13th Tribe is Arthur Koestler's hypothesis of how European or white Jews became Jews. The notion that in medieval Europe, there's this area in a region called Ashkenaz. And this was during the time that Christian crusades were taking place. This is also the time during the Arab crusades as well. And that you had, especially during medieval Europe, you have these Europeans in this region of Ashkenaz, which is Eastern Europe, who neither want to declare or become Christian, nor do they want to become Muslim, so they convert to become Jewish. And because they're from the European region Ashkenaz, they become Ashkenaz Jews. If we fast forward to the wars, the world wars, especially the Second World War, where you have all of these Yiddish-speaking Eastern European Jews. Where do they come from? Arthur Koestler suggests that you have these converts from Ashkenaz and medieval Europe because of those reasons. And there's other theories that go on from that work. But this was a bombshell, very controversial. Lots of Jewish, Ashkenaz Jews dismissed him. But he wound up mysteriously murdered in London in 1976. Maybe there wasn't a connection, I don't know. But I think that theory deserves to be investigated. From that study, it's also been suggested that the Ashkenaz Jews, because you have Ashkenaz Jews, you have Sephardic Jews, which would be from northern Africa, and you have a very controversial term, Falashka Jews, which is foreign, which those that, the Ethiopians, if you say that, a number of them would suggest that that's derogatory because they're saying there's nothing foreign about us because they can date their lineage all the way back to biblical times, either during the time of Solomon and the Queen of the South, or even the tribe of Dan, potentially, which would maybe even be a later theory, an alternate theory. But the idea that, so when I went to Israel in 2011, and we went to an Ethiopian absorption camp. That's a camp when they were rescuing a lot of these Ethiopian Jews from Ethiopia during the famine, Operation Moses, Operation Abraham. And so they put them in these camps, which look like prisons in a sense, but they're trying to absorb them into society, teaching them how to use appliances, teaching them how, kind of the lay of the land. But when I talked to one of the young girls, a teenager, and she was giving us a tour of the absorption camp, the Ethiopian absorption camp, and we started asking her about how long have, the connection, and she said something interesting, and this is kind of off script. I think the guide he had walked away, but she said, when my grandfather came, a part of Operation Moses, the first, 1980s, and these planes from Israel came, and the first thing my grandfather and the people there, they were Jews in Ethiopia, they said, how can you be Jewish? You're white. They had never seen white Jews. And they couldn't understand, how can you be Jewish because you're white? Because for him, Judaism was part of you able to connect yourself to all the way to the beginning. Connect yourself to the lineage, to the biblical figures who were part of your descendants. And so for them, they didn't understand how these people could be Jewish because they were white. So I think there's something definitely there. Your suspicion, yeah. Author Kostler, K-O-S-T-L-E-R. You might be able to find it on Amazon, yeah. Yeah, it was essentially banned for years, or blacklisted, but once Amazon came out, then you pretty much get everything on Amazon except for a book called it's a Ryan Anderson book, controversial book. You can't find that anywhere. You got to go to England. I think it was when when Harry became Steve or something like that. I don't know, something. But yeah, author Kostler, yes. Well, yeah, so Turkey is interesting because it's the furthest east in Europe, but it's also part of the Asian. So it's this interesting place. Yeah, yeah, because Turkey would be ancient Constantinople, if you will. So it would be the furthest east Europe, but also kind of bordering, depending on who you talk to and which time period, it would be part of the Asian. So Palestine and Jerusalem, part of Palestine and Israel, would be considered the ancient, an Afro-Asiatic region. Yeah, I mean, Israel, the internal, it's pretty much a lot like here. There's lots of racial tension, lots of racial issues. Um, there's a tribe of southern, sub-Saharan African called the Lalumba people. They tested their DNA, and their DNA tested out that connected them to the Levitical tribe, the biblical Levites, if you will. About 90%, over 90% of their DNA. But when you look at the Jews that enter Israel today, some of their, especially the Europeans, some of theirs would maybe test about 10%. So so the Lalumba sub-Saharan peoples, they're not Jewish, but I mean they're not practicing Jews, but their DNA connects them to the Levites. So there's a lot of history here, and I believe it really is under our noses to really look. We live in a culture, we live in a society that likes to rewrite history, or has been doing that for years, rewriting history, historical revisionism. That's why, for me, the Dead Sea Scrolls, I bring a whole new set of different questions, and because there's so much here that I think is really pertinent to what the Dead Sea Scrolls can teach the Black church, what the Dead Sea Scrolls can teach African American Christianity, and what the Dead Sea Scrolls can teach us as faith believers, if you will. What's the next slide? That was supposed to be Hebrew, but the character didn't come out. The next slide, yes. Yes, so I have a number of articles out. My book called Cultic Spiritualization it's due out. I was shooting for the end of the year. It's with the publisher, but it may be closer to the first part of the year. But I'll definitely keep you abreast of that. And then the one that will be coming after that would be looking at, and I'm still working with the title, either the African link at Qumran and in the Dead Sea Scrolls, or Africanizing the Dead Sea Scrolls. The next scroll, the next slide. So these are just kind of fragments, if you will. Okay, that's a war scroll. So these are kind of the fragments, what they would look like. Next one. So those are like the puzzle pieces, right? You're having to piece these together. These are fragments, literally almost thousands of fragments were found, and having to actually piece them together, which is the reason why digital imaging would come in handy. Next slide. So making sense of the scrolls. The next slide. So how to read a scroll. So one scroll called the Damascus document was found in cave 4. So you have the 11 caves. And so when you see a designation, you have the term Damascus document, but you'll have this designation 4QD and then maybe subscript. But it'll also have a number designation, 4Q266 to 4Q272, which means that you have 7 or 8 of these fragments. So 4 represents the cave number, where it was found. And so in your packet, you have like a blank sheet, and you can kind of fill that in if you want to. D represents the geographical area where the scroll was discovered. Remember where I talked about En-Gedi and Masada to the south of Qumran? Well, they also found some writings there as well. So that Q would be important for understanding the site at which this manuscript was found. The D represents the name, the scroll name, and the subscript represents the fragment or the manuscript, or essentially the fragment, right? And you have multiple fragments that were found of a particular writing. The next scroll, I'm talking about scrolls. And these are the 4 groups that we find connected to the area: Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots. The next slide. So here's what we get into the readings. How do the Dead Sea Scrolls impact the reading? So in Matthew 12, 11 through 12, it reads, "And he said to them," this is Jesus, "he said to them, what man shall there be among you that shall have one sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath day, will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? How much then is a man better than a sheep? Wherefore is it lawful to do well on the Sabbath day?" So the question is like, what's Jesus talking about? Who says that one should not help one's sheep out if it falls into a pit? Well, here's from the Cairo Damascus document, the 4QD, which is also part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it reads, and the blank part means that it's fragmented and there's a hole there. So we haven't been able to figure out what goes there. But it essentially reads, "No one should press his servant or his maidservant or his employee on the Sabbath day. No one should help an animal give birth on the Sabbath day. And if he makes it fall into a well or a pit, he should not take it out on the Sabbath." So Jesus, in light of the Dead Sea Scrolls, seems to be responding to the Qumran scenes. The next slide. Here's one that's also, I think, really pertinent for us. Relating to Genesis 9:24 through 27, the Noahic curse. Is there another slide? Is there something missing there? Yeah, there we go. And then Genesis 9:24 reads, "When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, 'Cursed be Canaan, lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers.' He also said, 'Blessed by the Lord my God be Shem, and let Canaan be his slave. For may God make space for Japheth, and let him live in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his slave.'" There's a commentary on Genesis found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. 4Q commentary on Genesis A, 4Q252. And it reads, "And Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done. And he said to him, 'Cursed be Canaan, he will be for his brothers a slave of slaves.' But he did not curse Ham, but only his son, for God had blessed the sons of Noah." That seems a little off. Yeah. There's a Jubilees passage as well, but I think that's a little bit off. So the next, okay, there we go. Jubilees, which is a pseudepigrapha writing, Jubilees 7 through 11 and 13 says, "And when evening came, and he entered his tent and lay down drunk, and he slept, and was uncovered in his tent, and as he was sleeping, and Ham saw Noah, his father, naked. And he went out and told his two brothers outside, and Shem took the garment, and he stood up, and he and Japheth," I think this is kind of all off. He had Japheth, "and they placed the garment on their shoulders, and turning backwards, they covered the shame of their father, and their faces were backward. And Noah woke from his wine," top part of the right column, "and knew everything which his youngest son had done to him. And he cursed his son and said, 'Cursed is Canaan, let him be an enslaved servant of his brothers.' And he blessed Shem. And Ham knew that his father had cursed his youngest son, and it was disgusting to him that he cursed his son. And he separated from his father, he and his son with him, Cush, Mitzrayim, and Put, and Canaan." The pseudepigrapha writing Jubilees and the commentary that was found on Genesis at Qumran sheds light on the Genesis passage. Doesn't take away, but it sheds light. And so this whole notion of the Noahic curse and Ham being cursed, that's a myth, that's a lie. And even intertestamental literature, even the Dead Sea Scrolls, says that's a lie. The book of Jubilees and the commentary on Qumran, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, both found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, testifies and supports the biblical tradition. But I like the commentary on Genesis because it says that Ham was not cursed because God had blessed the sons of Noah. I appreciate your attention. I appreciate hanging in with me and learning about the Dead Sea Scrolls. I don't know if there's any more slides. We can just kind of go through those, but here's some more references where the Dead Sea Scrolls speaks to Bible passages. Spiritual sacrifice, preparing the way of the Lord, and the way. Vision of kingdom of God, diet of John the Baptist and the Essenes, priestly dissension. I brought the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible. I could pass it around. It's very effective for textual studies to see the different versions of the Old Testament, if you will. And here are the sectarian writings of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Both of these are translated. I have the Hebrew at home. So yeah, in your free time, you want to get these, you can read them in the afternoon. So blessings to you. Any questions, comments? I appreciate you all.
Thank you very much for coming and sharing, man. That was very enlightening. As a matter of fact, I want to do it one day on a Sunday and be able to a dialogue here that you and I can talk about and put on the streaming for all to see, because it's my desire to bring in on Sundays even, conversations like this and things where I think, especially for, and I make no apologies about wanting to reach an African-American culture biblically, because of the fact that, I think we need it. And considering the fact that so much of, as I shared with you earlier, I don't know if you've ever heard of, brother, this book called Jesus and John Wayne, which I just finished reading. It is very enlightening. Y'all, it's a really good book. But it talks about, and the author, I forget her name, but she talks about how evangelicals corrupted a faith and fractured a nation. And because, we get so much in seminary, and I forget which seminary you went to. Which one was it? Fuller, yeah. A bastion of evangelicalism, and so, you like myself, we've been trained in these seminaries, but so much of that history is left out. So we want to be able to kind of inform and bring this information to our culture, the people that we are trying to reach, so that they can be better armed and better make a defense and apologetic of the gospel that we believe in. And so thank you, Doc, once again. And we'll look forward to hearing from you on tomorrow as well. But that was indeed a very wonderful presentation. So put your hands together one more time. Thank you. And so I know that choir rehearsals are going to begin here in about 20 minutes. And I hope that you all appreciated this. We're going to get ready to close out. And I'm sure some of you I'm sure my dad especially is going to ask some questions of you here in a minute as well. So, but let's close so we can be dismissed. Father God, we come before you right now just thanking you for Dr. Hopkins, who has blessed us with wonderful and powerful information and brought to light so much of how the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Bible informs, even our cultural awareness, oh Lord. And so, God, I just thank you for this presentation. And Lord, continue to bless him on tomorrow to share a word with us, and use him for your glory. In Jesus' name, amen.